Hello internet friends, welcome to the second video in this series looking at the many different versions of Star Wars Galaxies. In the first video we discussed the different servers running in 2021, but in this follow-up we're going to discuss why there are so many different versions of Star Wars Galaxies in the first place. To do that we need to chart the game's development, and in doing so we'll arrive at the three main iterations of the game, those being the pre-CU or pre-combat upgrade, the combat upgrade itself, and then the NGE, the new game experience. So let's dive in. Star Wars Galaxies started development in 2000 with industry veterans Rich Vogel and Raph Koster at the helm. In the early 2000s it was still possible for teams working on MMOs to have outlandish ideas about creating truly immersive worlds, and from the outset their vision for the game was ambitious. An interconnected player economy, cities run by players, vast immersive planets, all of these things were on the table. At first things went well. The team regularly communicated their design ideas with a loyal following on the game's forums, and anticipation grew with showings at E3 in 2001 where the game won several Game of the Show awards. Soon however the team found themselves under immense pressure to get the game finished, and even after a public beta in which many problems had been highlighted, the game was released and hit retail shelves in June of 2003. As you might imagine, the problems identified in the beta persisted into the live game. The all too familiar launch day woes were one issue, with players unable to log in due to overwhelming demand, but more concerning for the long-term health of the game were the many bugs and missing features. Player cities and vehicles were missing, as was the much anticipated space portion of the game. There had simply not been enough development time, particularly for a game as complex as this one. You could say therefore that Star Wars Galaxies was on the back foot from the beginning. Although many consider the years before the combat upgrade to be the golden age of Galaxies, this is what's known as the pre-CU version of the game, our first version, and although the devs worked like Trojans to squash bugs and add the missing features such as jump to light speed, the space portion of the game,
get ready to jump to light speed. Introducing a revolutionary new system of real-time space combat.
The complaining from players nevertheless continued. One persistent problem was the combat system, which never worked as intended. Originally, players were not supposed to be able to tackle anything like a Crate Dragon solo, with buffs allowing a 10% increase in stats at best. When higher level crafters started crafting buffs that boosted players up to 400%, it was clear something had gone wrong. All of this is not to say that players weren't enjoying the game, they were, particularly the social aspects and the community features. But pre-CU Galaxies had its problems, just like every other version of the game, and the clamour for change was persistent. Enter the combat upgrade, or CU. This is the second stage in Star Wars Galaxies' life cycle, and largely a response to the problems with combat and the difficulty of balancing so many professions. Levels were introduced in an attempt to give players a clear progression path, while classes were divided up into the holy trinity of MMOs, tank, damage and healer, with crowd control becoming a fourth pillar. Combat became faster, and the grouping of players in order to tackle more difficult foes was incentivized with increased XP gain. Sweeping changes were made to the armor system in the game, again in the name of giving players a clearer idea of their role in combat, but also to counteract the idea that one armor is always the best, as had been previously the case. However, the CU was not well received. Many felt that the complexity of the pre-CU had been lost, and due to the number of changes to combat professions, who were no longer reliant on crafters and entertainers for their survival, there was a feeling that the social glue of the game was being degraded. SOE President John Smedley himself took to the forums to apologise for the unfinished nature of the update, but to the chagrin of those petitioning for a rollback to the pre-CU, reiterated that the combat upgrade was here to stay. In hindsight, it's perhaps clear to see what the devs were trying to do. Despite the game being lauded for its open and sandboxy nature, another persistent complaint was the lack of directed content for players. It was part of the original design in many ways. This was a simulation and players made their own fun, working together to harvest resources and build a truly player-driven economy. There was no need for quests. A player's direction was provided by other players. But the trend in MMOs towards more focused content had been gathering momentum for years, and in order to provide this, the devs needed a combat system that was at least somewhat balanced. Rage of the Wookiees was their attempt to add a chunk of questing all at once. The Wookiee homeworld wasn't as large or open as the original planets, more like a theme park in the WoW mold, but it's hard to see how this expansion would have worked pre-CU, where any player could tackle any mob in the game with the right build and suite of buffs. Despite all these changes and the gradual acceptance of the CU by those players who decided to stay, there had been something of an exodus just after its release. There was still dissatisfaction with the game. Not just for players, several of whom had by this time banded together to form the first emulator projects, promising a return to the halcyon days of the pre-CU, but also from the higher-ups at Lucasfilm. It was felt the reason the game was not doing as well as multiplayer behemoth World of Warcraft was because it wasn't exciting or Star Warsy enough. This was one of the biggest IPs in the world after all. Why was it getting crushed by Blizzard's upstart MMO? To paraphrase a quote from the time, yes again from John Smedley, who has gone on record several times apologising for the mistakes made, so please don't go after the guy. Nevertheless, he said this, that sandbox games just don't work, and that the team had spent too much time delivering the Uncle Owen experience instead of the Luke Skywalker hero experience. It should be clear at this point that whatever the original design documents for Star Wars Galaxies may have been, they had been abandoned. The race was now on to beat WoW, and the team at SOE and the producers at Lucasfilm were ready to do whatever it took. Enter ignominiously stage left the New Game Experience, or NGE. For the sake of clarity, this is the third and final version of Star Wars Galaxies. Designed to turn Star Wars Galaxies into a fast-action MMO, the NGE tore through almost every aspect of the game. Gone was the need to socialise, leaving entertainers without a purpose. Gone was the emphasis on player-crafted goods, leaving traders without a business to run, a situation that played havoc with the game's intricate economy. Players found that core systems had been removed, such as creature handling, and the biggest change from a hotbar MMO with tab targeting to a shallow, twitchy FPS left players feeling betrayed and resentful.
Recently, the MMO Star Wars Galaxies underwent a dramatic change in gameplay that resulted in, well, what else? Cries of outrage from former fanboys. We've learned to ignore these types of things. We get them all the time, but producer Julio Torres doesn't mind addressing the controversy, and that's why he's here right now. Julio, thank you for joining us.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fantastic. And I'm sorry, you're a nice guy, but I think I'm supposed to shiv you in the ribs and or lynch you, according to what these forums are saying.
The players, yes.
Despite the cringy start, this is actually a really good interview to have a listen to, where Julio Torres comes on and does his best to defend the changes that they made, and the somewhat cringy presenter gets a little better, asking some tough questions later on with some callers asking their questions as well. This interview and the other references I've used can be found in the description of the video down below, so have a watch if you're interested. It didn't help the developers' case that the NGE had been developed in a few short months and that it went live days after the release of the game's third expansion, The Trials of Obi-Wan, which offered the chance to aid the venerable Jedi on the lava planet of Mustafar. Having just paid for the latest DLC, then finding these sweeping changes forced upon them, players asked for refunds, and SOE, in the wisest decision it had made for a while, obliged. Perhaps by now we're able to see a pattern forming in Star Wars Galaxy's turbulent life cycle. There are problems with the game that both players and developers are aware of, sometimes for the same reasons, sometimes not, but when changes come, they are so sweeping and rushed that the backlash is almost inevitable. It took years for the game to return to something like its former self after the NGE. But change it did, with many of the gutted systems being added back in. The team at SOE even improved on and added intricate new ideas, a good example being the Beastmaster profession, a more complex version of the former creature handler and bioengineer, and the storyteller system that allowed players to create their own quests and place items in the world, if only for a short time before their decorations went poof. The many changes and additions that took place after the NGE can be seen as evidence that the original design ideas for Galaxies worked. Player interdependency, socialization, and the economy were all essential to the game's ongoing success, and to pull them out in favour of a cheap and transitory thrill was a mistake. Luckily, the subsequent teams for Galaxies realised this, and the NG version of Galaxies, unlike the others, was blessed with the time it needed to go forward. If not from strength to strength, then from ignominy to a rich and engaging game by the end. It would probably still be around today if it were not for SOE losing the Star Wars license.
The end of Star Wars Galaxies. I'm Jeff Gerstmann. Manning the game this time around, Ryan Davis. Ryan, how's it going?
Pretty good, Jeff. Kicking it here on the couch. This is an 8-year-old MMO at this point, and it's gone through seemingly a huge number of changes over the years. They've revamped the hell out of it.
Yeah, well, that was the big controversial thing about this game, is it started out kind of as one thing, and then, you know, as that wasn't really taking off and doing well, they rolled out a very big and controversial patch that changed kind of the very nature of the game to
now
more
we've
like
got
what it is now.
Now we've got Star Wars Old Republic is launching soon, I'm told, in theory.
Despite the video's clickbaity title then, I'm not going to tell you which version of Star Wars Galaxies is best, because I honestly don't think any one version is. The pre-CU was a pure sandbox with all the perks and pitfalls that entails. The CU attempted to remedy the broken combat, and I remember it being largely effective personally, but it's true it was not as deep as the previous version. It also lacked the variety and sheer amount of content that the NGE ultimately offered after the developers got their act together. When looking back at the life of Galaxies, I often feel like the game was a neglected child being pulled back and forth between warring parents. So many different ideas, so many competing goals, all at the expense of the player, who was often overlooked in the race to be the biggest and the best. So my apologies. I can't tell you outright which version of Galaxies is best. Galaxies is, in a sense, the life it has led, and I feel it would be simplistic and reductive to single out any one version as king, since this overlooks the strengths and failings of the others. I hope that you enjoyed this video and it went some way to explaining the various differences between the different versions of Star Wars Galaxies, from the pre-CU to the combat upgrade right through to the NGE. In the final part of this mini-series, I'm going to look at the future of the game, so I hope you'll stick around for that. Thanks for your comments as always, they really do give me food for thought as I'm planning out these videos, so I hope to see you in the next one, and bye for now.